We're just giving everyone a final moment to join us. Hello, everyone. Okay, hope everyone can hear us loud and clear. We'll get started here. So thank you for joining today's DPA webinar. If you're new to the webinar series, this is part of the Digital Pathology Association program. And today's webinar is special in that we're collaborating with our affiliates CAP and SIIM. John, can you give us a quick intro and background of CAP and SIIM?
Yeah, no, thank you, everyone. We know that time is precious and appreciate everyone's time and effort to be here with us today. And here in digital pathology, this is really a global collaboration and really to get us to where we need to be. And you're going to see some of the efforts that have been initiated with the College of American Pathologists and the Society for Imaging and Informatics in Medicine. And so we have representation here from all three of our societies here to go over this. So we think this is a very exciting opportunity, a very exciting partnership. And we look forward to exploring even more, but give you that first introduction of what we've been working on today.
Thank you, John. So to quickly introduce ourselves, my name is Jennifer Samboy. I'm with Philips, but today I'm wearing my co-chair DPA Education Committee hat. And joining me is my colleague, John Groth, representing the Regulatory Task Force. For today's webinar, we are talking about advancing imaging interoperability together, a DPA-CAP SIIM collaboration to improve standardized workflow adoption. And what we hope you take away from today's webinar are three key topics. The first is reporting out the summary of the key findings of the DICOM Toolkit that was collaborated between the DPA, CAP, and SIIM. This will have a huge implication on imaging standards moving forward, as well as DICOM and how we adopt them in our everyday operations. The second is a deep dive on the importance of DICOM and having imaging health exchange standards. So our speakers today will go into this in detail with two presenters up front and then a panel discussion towards the end, focusing really on why it's important to be consistent in interoperable imaging metadata across pathology, but also the other domains like radiology, etc. And to close, we will talk about how the role of the DPA in accelerating cross-organizational collaboration in advancing pathology interoperability is important for clinical care, operations, and of course, innovation. So we thank you for your time today. These are important topics, and as always, we try to cover the topics that are most relevant and important to our DPA members. With that, I turn it over to John to give a quick intro of our speakers today. John?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, we're very excited. As we alluded to, we have a variety of individuals here with us today that are key individuals in the digital pathology space, both at the organizational level and the standards level. So you're gonna first meet today Dr. Alex Tobin, after hearing these initial introductions, who's from Cincinnati Children's, who is the upcoming president for SIIM and a longtime advocate for imaging informatics. Then you're going to see Kevin Schaap from the College of American Pathologists, who is leading a large portion of the informatics efforts and is the current secretariat for the DICOM Working Group 26 and IHE Palm. And then we have Dr. Raj Dash from Duke University, who is a world expert in IHE and is one of the co-chairs for the IHE Palm group, helping to devise a lot of these profiles that we're going to talk about today. And then Dr. Mustafa Youssef, who from the University of Michigan is the co-chair for the DICOM Working Group 26 and a world expert in that, and to highlight the work that's being done at University of Michigan, but also with the DICOM Working Group 26. So we're truly honored to have this illustrious panel with us today. And so here, in terms of this, for our disclaimers, for here, nothing that we're going to be talking about related to products, but here we have listed here that really no conflicts really related to this, but any other specific questions that come up, please refer back to this disclaimer. And then for general information, as questions come on, we're going to have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the session, so please post your Q&A in the box as time goes on. And just one thing to kind of highlight this and why we started this is that really kind of in the Q1, where now we're a little bit past the Q1, is to have a quick update related to regulatory and standards. And really, the DPA Regulatory and Standards Task Force is a great group of individuals that's working to bring clarity to the regulatory pathway, but also the development and adoption of standards. And so this is today is focusing largely on that standards. And so as you heard already from this process, really we have three main aims. The first, to go over this DICOM toolkit. We want to highlight the importance of DICOM and IHE for the standards and discuss really kind of the role and how we're collaborating across organizations and global organizations in that process. And so with that, first I'd like to introduce here Dr. Alex Tobin. Alex?
Thanks, and thank you for having me. I appreciate being here and being able to talk on this topic. I want to start with where radiology started in the 1980s. At this time, digital imaging was just being born. Radiology was moving from a film-based world to an electronic world, and that started with really expensive machines. These were MRI and CT scanners, and those machines were connected directly to computers, allowing the radiologist to be able to view images in an electronic way as they were coming off. These tended to be proprietary formats that were submitted directly to the machines. And as radiology grew up, we started learning about a problem. As we grew into the digital space, we started learning a problem, and that we would have devices that were sending out that proprietary information, and every machine had its own format. This was all the different vendors had their different flavors of the imaging that they were sending. And so one organization may end up with multiple scanners and no way to view it, but radiologists needed a way to view all the images in one place. And so that's where DICOM was born out of. DICOM, and I do have a few QR codes throughout here to provide some references if you're interested. DICOM was developed through partnership with NEMA and started with the American College of Radiology as a way to send information across and be in a standard way so that there was interoperability. And so those same CT scanners that were putting out images all started to have that same file format, that same type of information. It was a way to have those machines work across an enterprise and in a distributed fashion so that radiologists could work and see images no matter where they were and no matter what system they were using. This extends more than just CT scanners. In the modern practice, we have modalities of different types. Those are things like CT, MRI, nuclear medicine, X-ray, ultrasound, PET. All of those can have different vendors. And so in an example here, we have three different vendors, A, B, and C, all connecting to a central imaging management system or PACS. And all of that happens because of DICOM in that standard way. And so we have standard expectations for the data. Having that data is really important. And one of the really cool things with DICOM is it's not just the images, it's the metadata. And the metadata is where the real power comes in. And so if we have images, we can use tools like a DICOM router. And that DICOM router can do things like when we're sending it, we can create those complex if-then rules. Those complex if-then rules can look at the individual information in the DICOM and drive things like artificial intelligence. And so it could say, if there is a study description of a certain type with a modality of a certain type and an orientation of the patient and a slice thickness, send that information to an AI platform, have the AI do its thing and send it back to the router. And then when the router comes back in, send that final result back to the imaging management system. And it's not just related to DICOM routers. So this information can be used to build display protocols. We have imaging across the enterprise, not just radiologic imaging, but scope imaging, photography, point of care ultrasound, ophthalmology imaging. Sorry, that's a hard word to say. Ophthalmology imaging that can be sent, and pathology imaging deserves to be in this place as well. And so you could build these complex hanging protocols so that similar needs show up, or similar patient conditions show up together, and we can compare them together. Having all of this imaging in one place allows us all to be better physicians, taking care of the patient in a more holistic way. And so again, we can use the DICOM metadata to build these complex hanging protocols or display protocols as we're viewing. And it could do other things as well. So you could combine the disease patterns together. So in this patient with a superficial nasal tumor, could see the radiologic imaging, but also the pathologic imaging that goes with it, and tie it together. And then use that type of information to be able to do something like an image transfer. If the patient needs to go somewhere else for a second opinion or for continuation of care delivery, instead of having information tied into standard metadata fields like this is the study, or say send all the pathology, you could have the information. I'm sorry, the animation doesn't line up here. All the things that are related to the specific disease process. And so if we were focusing instead, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, but primary and anatomic sequence to be head and neck or whole body, and then we would be able to exclude the things on the abdomen that are related to a secondary disease condition. Those types of information could be sent rather than sending the entire patient jacket and the large volumes of data that make up all of medical imaging. So I'll pass it off to the next to talk about where other pieces fit in. Oh, this one's still me. I'm sorry. So the CAP, DPA, and SIIM did send out a survey to talk about the pathologist DICOM toolkit assessment. And this survey was sent out earlier in the year. It asked several questions. I'm going to present some of that data. And so the first question was, would a DICOM starter toolkit for pathology be helpful? And overwhelmingly, the answer was positive, of yes or maybe. Of more than 75% were yes or maybe, and with more than 50% being positive, and the yes. What should be included in a DICOM toolkit? When I hear the term DICOM toolkit, I wonder this: what does that actually mean? So this is what it means to the survey respondents. The most common answer of something that should be included was an overview of the DICOM standard and how it applies to pathology. But other key things that had a large plurality of responses of what's needed would be a step-by-step implementation guide, tools for converting proprietary format to DICOM, and then things like workflow integration or sample DICOM files. So now I'll pass it to Kevin to talk about DICOM and IHE in practice.
All right, thank you, Dr. Tobin. So, yep, I'm going to take cover a lot of similar things that Dr. Tobin just went over, but I'll give it to you a little more from a pathology perspective. So today I'm going to talk about DICOM for pathology, what it is, why it matters, and why you may hear people talking about it as digital pathology continues to scale. I'll aim to keep this approachable, but fair warning, DICOM can get technical pretty quickly, and that's partly the point. So, what is DICOM? DICOM stands for Digital Imaging and Communications in Medicine. At its core, it's a standard, a very detailed set of rules for how medical images are stored, described, transmitted, and understood across systems. As we heard, radiology has been using DICOM for decades across multiple kinds of modalities. So for pathology, though, it's newer to the space, and whole slide images have their own unique characteristics. For one, they're much larger, they're more complex, and historically they've been stored in proprietary formats. Well, we saw that happen in radiology. Pathology is facing the same thing, and so now we're looking to solve this in our own space with DICOM. So DICOM is aiming to bring standardization to our environment. So I'd like to There's an analogy I heard before, so I'm kind of shamelessly borrowing this because I thought when I heard this, it really kind of conveyed things to me. So, you can think of DICOM like a shipping container for global trade. Before shipping containers, goods were transported in all kinds of inconsistent packaging, barrels, crates, sacks. It was inefficient, hard to track, and difficult to move between ships, trucks, and trains. So then came the standardized container. Same size, same structure, universally recognized. Now, any port, truck, or crane in the world knows exactly how to handle it. It doesn't just carry the image, it carries patient information, acquisition details, device metadata, and the context needed to interpret the image. So in our case, it could be organ site, tissue type, the stains that were used, or IHCs. And so without that standardization, interpretation becomes extremely difficult. So why does this matter in pathology? Well, today many digital pathology workflows rely on vendor-specific formats, custom viewers, and we have limited interoperability. So that creates friction in several areas. Sharing cases between institutions becomes very complicated if the other institution has a format that you don't have a viewer that supports it. Um, Integrating with enterprise imaging systems. Most enterprise imaging systems are going to be DICOM focused, and well, we're not using DICOM, so we're not really using the standard that enterprise tools tend to expect. And then scaling AI tools across platforms. As these AI tools are trained and developed, so often they're used and trained on proprietary formats. And so if we start to standardize, we may be able to do more with our AI in terms of accessing the metadata, or at least these tools are being trained on the same types of data that everybody will have. So DICOM addresses a lot of these things by enabling interoperability. Different systems can read the same image. It addresses longevity. Data remains usable even as you change your vendors. And integration. Pathology can plug into enterprise imaging ecosystems alongside radiology. But here's where it gets a little bit more technical. DICOM for pathology introduces concepts like tiled image pyramids for managing extremely large whole slide imaging, multi-resolution encoding, standardized metadata schemas tied to controlled vocabularies like SNOMED, CT, and LINQ, and integration with workflow through services like DICOM Web APIs. You don't need to memorize all of those, but they reflect how DICOM scales to pathology's complexity. So why it feels complicated and why that's okay. If it sounds complicated, that's because it is. It's not just a file format, it's a data model, it's a communication protocol, it's a workflow framework. And in pathology, we're essentially adapting something that was developed for pathology and adding to a standard so that it accommodates our pathology images. That complexity is a trade-off for standardization, interoperability, and future proofing. So if you only remember a few things from our presentation, just remember that DICOM is the standard that allows medical images to be shared and understood across systems. It acts like a universal container for both images and their meaning. And in pathology, it's the key enabler for scalable digital workflows and AI adoption. So even if the details feel dense, the goal is simple. We're looking to make pathology images as interoperable and portable as radiology images are today. So with that, I'm going to transition actually into IHE, which is another key piece of the puzzle here when we're talking about standardizing things. So we've talked about standardizing images and all the metadata that goes into them. So where IHE, or Integrating Healthcare Enterprise, comes into play is they create things called profiles. So they leverage existing standards like DICOM and HL7 and SNOMED and like other, they combine these different components to make sure that workflows get standardized. So um, it's not just about the image, it's about how do I pull data into an image? How do I map metadata into it? So as we know, your scanner's not going to natively have all of the image about a particular slide. It needs to make a call to the LIS to say, hey, can you tell me the specimen type, the organ site, the stains, etc., patient information. So what IHE profiles tend to do is they start to connect different pieces or different components in your workflow and allow them to exchange information. So on this first screen here, you can see there are a lot of Palm profiles that exist for different areas in pathology and laboratory medicine. And so you can see in that middle box on the left here that there's one for digital pathology. So what are the scope of these digital pathology profiles? Well, we've got three in the works right now. One that's been released, the digital pathology image acquisition profile. So It's constrained to creation, storage, and display of the DICOM file, but it really is all about also mapping in that metadata from the LIS into the image. Then we have the digital pathology ordering workflow. This one's in development, focused on workflow, meeting the communication needs of the image manager and the order filler and the acquisition manager when new whole site images are created. And then the digital pathology evidence creation profile, which is really focused on the analysis of a whole site image. So you have these additional pieces that created by AI tools. How do you marry them to the image and have them brought along, and where do you store it, and how should it be handled and accessed? So I'm not going to go over this in detail, but you can see there's a lot of different transactions that happen across the digital pathology space. And so all of these are covered in some capacity under one of the profiles I just mentioned. So here you can kind of see where DPIA comes into play. It talks about which components in the system need to fill what roles in terms of exchanging data, adding it to the DICOM file, or perhaps surfacing things from an AI model, etc. But it shows where each piece connects and talks about how the transactions should occur between the different components you would have in your digital pathology workflow. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Groth for the panel discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you so much, Alex, for those nice discussions there. I think that will really help the audience. And I think here, so this is where we wanted to get into for the panel in the process to get going on. And a lot of these were touched upon, I think, here to come back, but I wanted to come back and revisit them. And I wanted to come first with the third one. So Alex, yeah, you highlighted kind of, where radiology was in that process. What would you say is the top 3 lessons learned related to radiology and applicability to pathology?
It's a great question. There are one of the things that's been a barrier in the past, or a lesson learned for us in the past that may be less of an issue into the future, is the utility of some of the DICOM fields. For us, some of the really key fields that help the humans identify studies are things like procedure description and series description. And in informatics language, those fields are garbage. They're all free text. And so there's not standardization on those fields across vendors, across institutions. And so that causes challenges when you want to have imaging across multiple organizations, or when you have multiple vendors in your space. That causes challenges with things like display protocols. But all the data is there mathematically for these things in the DICOM, and artificial intelligence systems can read that information in a way that humans cannot. And so that's why I say I'm not as sure that's a problem moving forward. It's also very domain specific. Across the enterprise outside of radiology, another lesson we've learned is that it's a standard, but how different specialties or even different vendors choose to implement the standard is variable. A good example of that is in ophthalmology. In ophthalmology imaging, a lot of the machines are all-in-ones. It provides the camera, the storage, the information system, all there. And it also outputs the report of the data and of what would go to a record system. Those reports are often PDF style reports, and they're wrapped in DICOM. So they're DICOM compliant, but they don't have the raw images that are sent to an archive. And so they're less useful to be able to have secondary analysis around them. If you want to study what's going on, in this case, in the eye, you don't have that raw data to be able to build the next level artificial intelligence algorithm, or to do the base research to be able to answer questions. You just have what the machine outputs. And then those all-in-one systems, because they don't always talk to electronic health records, don't communicate or don't use the standard. They take proprietary shortcuts to get around the standard. And so things like sharing information, even as simple as demographics, can be difficult.
No, No, thank you, Alex. I think that's great. And one question I have too is out there with the general radiologists in here.
Yeah.
Is this even a discussion amongst radiology departments whether you should be implementing a DICOM versus a non-DICOM compliant system in radiology? Is it even a question?
No, it's not. And I think the detail that Kevin highlighted is interesting. And thinking of it as a container is the right way to do it. Most of the radiologists don't understand anything about DICOM, right? They may know that it exists. They may hear that there are some DICOM fields, but there are thousands of DICOM fields that are available that have data within them, and almost none of the radiologists know of that data or use that data. And again, much of it is meaningless for a human reader, so it's not something that they should know. The standard just means things work, and that's valuable. And so we can have images across the country, whether it's teleradiology or second opinion workflows, that just work because everyone's using that standard.
No, I think that's great. And I think that's an important lesson, I think, for the pathologists, is that's where we want to get, right? Where it's not even a question. It just happens, right? And just people, it works and it just goes on, and I think that I think is probably one of the biggest lessons. So thank you. So now I want to hear from our co-chairs from the DICOM Working Group 26 and the IHE Palm Group. So Mustafa, why do you view that these standards are essential right now, as of today, this moment?
Right. Yeah, they are really important, as you know, right now, especially for the interoperability. So, for example, right now, the DICOM works really best when paired with the IHE workflow and the validate through the, as you see, the CAP and SIIM clinical communities, the cross-organization work group that include vendor, clinicians, and informatics. That's the right model right now. But I want to also focus on one thing that right now, especially the problem of lessons also learned from radiology. I really wanted to make sure that, because, for example, from Michigan Medicine, that we are doing the enterprise workflow, and we really learned the journey that took 2 decades from radiology, and we took it, we compressed that timeline, and learned a lot from their workflow, especially the IHE profile, the connectathons, the mandates. But unfortunately, also, there are things that we also learn from it. So, for example, any fragmented vendor adoption, we want to avoid that workflow. And one of the lessons that we really need to learn, that standards alone don't drive the adoption. Yes, in DICOM, we can push standards, but community pressure, regulatory nudges, and education do. That is the most important thing that I want to emphasize on regarding adoption of the standards.
No, thank you. That was awesome. Mustafa.
And
Raj.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in on this first bullet point. For many of the folks here, we might be speaking to the choir, but I think it's important to recognize that standards support interoperability, they support compatibility, reliability, innovation, with the potential to increase functionality across all vendors that support a particular standard while decreasing costs. Why now? I think digital pathology standards are maturing to the point where it's the right time for vendors to invest their time and effort and resources to accelerate the accessibility of their products in a interoperable digital pathology ecosystem. For those of you that are not vendors on the call, but have decision-making power within your organization, you need to express that the vendors that you bring on board support digital pathology standards, and you have to dig a little deeper than simply asking, do you support DICOM? You have to ask, in what ways are you supporting that standard? Are you supporting all of the required elements? Are you just creating a file with an accession number So we have image files out there that are being created that only have one identifier. That's certainly not a best practice, right? You want to have two identifiers on all of your assets associated with patients, but which vendors support that? So it's a little deeper than just saying what standards do you support and then knowing the name of the standard. And that's where a little bit where IHE comes in, and I feel that the rest of the world's a little bit ahead of the United States in terms of having IHE as a requirement for vendor selection. But hopefully we'll get there. The bottom line is we need to get our vendors to understand the importance of the standards, leveraging the standards, recognizing how it can help their products and their offerings, and also incentivize them in the right way to get engaged with IHE, with DICOM, and make sure that not only are their product roadmaps communicated to the groups developing the standards to make sure their products are going to be supported, but also help contribute to that work.
No, I
So,
think
yeah, I'm sorry, John. I want to
go
also
ahead.
add to Dr. Dash and also Dr. Tobin that, there is also every day I hear that there is this misconception that, there is multiple version of pathology DICOM and which pathology DICOM what we are using, which it is one DICOM standard. It's not a split by specialty. What's really exists is the supplement, as Dr. Tobin, Dr. Dash, and also Kevin mentioned, which is the most important one, the supplement 145, that is really did exactly the whole slide imaging. So the pathology images and radiology images live under the same standard, use the same foundational metadata structure, and can really use as one standard. When correctly implemented, that's the most important thing. So we really need to work with the vendor and take out this confusion that usually come from inconsistent kind of vendor implementation, not from standard itself by having multiple flavors.
I think that's important, Mustafa, exactly, because I hear that a lot too. And I think for just to get people not to go into too much technical, the standards allows some variability that allows it to be in that process, whether you want to do like JPEG XL, JPEG 2000 compression, but it's all within that framework and it provides those bases. So it greatly minimizes the amount of effort that the vendors need to be able to understand. And so, no, I think those are hugely important. And I think here, one of the things I want to add as to why what I'm seeing from Essential now, and both Raj and Mustafa described it, right? There's a lot of movements that are going on. Right here, you're hearing from the DPA, you're hearing from CAP, you're hearing from SIIM, you're hearing from IHE Palm, you're hearing from DICOM Working Group 26. This is a global effort in that process that is going on. And I can tell you that there are dozens of people across the spectrum, specifically related to pathology, that are meeting weekly in some capacity on this. And so there is initiatives coming up here. For 2 years ago, what we had with the regulatory side is that the FDA came about and said that if vendors submit DICOM, there's going to be an accelerated process for submission. One of the things that you have just seen posted is that there's an own collaboration with DPA and the FDA, which is working on a variety of things, and it's standards-based. The ARPA-H initiative, things that are coming up. There was so many initiatives. There was an initiative that all of our societies here submitted for related to interoperability issues, related to the government initiatives for patient access in this. So this is really, I think, the perfect time to really kind of take that and that push, and exactly what Dr. Yusuf said, that ability is, it's just to say it is not enough. These incentivizations are happening. The connectathons are going to be announced here very shortly related to that. That provides opportunities for the vendors to get in. So I think right now, this big push is real and it's happening. So and then from that, Kevin, why do you think from the standards and metadata are essential now?
So I think with the rapid proliferation of all these AI tools, I think I think it's going to be essential that they have a way to access additional pieces of information, right? We've quickly moved on from we're just analyzing the pixels to now we're starting to dig more into, we're moving more into these multimodal models that need greater access to information. And, a lot of these tools, they're really only going to ever work. They'll never reach their full potential if we're not standardizing how we store and capture a lot of these things. So by increasing the adoption of these standards, we improve the rate at which these tools can perform. And I think that can be a boon, across the world once they reach a certain level of capability. And then on top of that, I mean, it keeps things cleaner for organizations moving forward in the future. I think that idea of longevity, being able to utilize digital assets that you created as little as 5 years ago is going to be pretty relevant as certain formats either get abandoned or people move on from them with the new generation of technology. So I think a lot of this is going to be essential to keeping digital pathology adoption strong.
No, I agree. And I think to kind of piggyback on one thing that you just said, I think goes back also to what Alex said from the radiology. When radiology was going through this in the 80s and 90s, there was much less vendors in the space. In pathology, there are a lot of you vendors that are here and a lot of vendors outside that, which makes it even more complex of a process. So it's better to get around this now than to keep waiting. The longer we wait, the more complex it is. And that's where, to Kevin's, what he highlighted earlier, the complexity of the standards is to allow for that harmonization. But the complexity we have now exceeds that of what exists within that standard. And so I think those are important points to think about.
This is also a place where both individual and societal advocacy is really important. In the early days of DICOM, the American College of Radiology led a lot of that advocacy, and essentially made it a requirement for some of their certifications. They also work in the advocacy towards like NIH, and if DICOM becomes a requirement from an NIH side, that helps to move the needle quite a bit. If all research needs to be performed there, and the imaging sent, that's a big mover. And so those type of efforts, though, do require the larger societies to be able to advocate on the behalf of it. So the individuals in the societies moving up to push this standard as a beneficial element for the specialty.
No, thank you, Alex. And I think here, so for Raj, what do you think right now from like a general pathologist out there, right, who's not an informatics specialist, not an informatician, doesn't understand DICOM, IHE, what do you think the real barriers are to them to implement these in real world practice?
Yeah, so I think that if I could summarize it, it comes down to lack of appropriate incentives. So there has to be a return on investment for any practice leader to implement digital pathology and to specifically request that implementation occur in a way where they're thinking about the long-term costs and the ability to increase feature set and or serve their practice needs by leveraging vendors that have and support standards. I think it's also at a national level, part of the responsibility of our large organizations, DPA, CAP, to help create the appropriate incentives like our counterparts have done in other parts of the world, where it's part of legislation. Now we have evidence, right? So there's precedent for there to be rule writing, such as the ones we had around certified EHRs, and that drove an industry, right? And certain vendors flourished with those incentives, and I think the same kind of thing could happen for digital pathology and in general support of healthcare IT infrastructure. Vendors increase costs by using proprietary technology overall for the healthcare system. They might be decreased costs for them, but they don't have an incentive necessarily to not use their proprietary technologies that they're very comfortable with. Healthcare organizations are the next organization down in the stream, and they incur these increased costs to implement that proprietary technology, recognizing now they're locked into a vendor, and when they need to address a functionality that particular vendor that they selected is not going to implement, they need to move on to another vendor. Of course, healthcare organizations have to increase price or lobby for increased reimbursement to cover those costs. And we get into a cycle where we have healthcare technology, because of improving patient care and the afforded functionality from these new technologies. We want to have them implemented, but everything costs money. And it ends up that patients and or payers are paying more due to rising healthcare costs. And we all need to do our part to help address this healthcare cost equation, at least as it relates to healthcare IT, and by even as an individual, recognizing the importance of standards and then asking for them. And even if it's an individual trying to incentivize a vendor to support a standard, doing it at an individual level.
No, I agree. And I think here, so for this, to piggyback on that, so Mustafa, right? So can you describe your implementation, your clinical implementation with DICOM?
Right.
And what barriers you encountered?
Right. So the first barrier, like even with our institution, was the file size, which is storage. That's a common reality. So a single whole slide image, as we all know, it's really like sometimes reach more than 4 gigabytes. And with that kind of architecture of much, radiology used to much smaller size than this, majority of the packs and archiving system and VNAs are not really, designed for this. So we're talking about petabytes because majority of institution scale it to the next 10 years, for the archiving. And this is extremely challenging to kind of communicate with your team, with the institution, educate your institution about, yes, we might need that amount of data, but remember that we're still digitizing a glass slide. So there is a possibility of having a different tier of storage system, maybe a cold tier, hot tier, make sure that, we need it for the first 3 to 6 months. As you know, in pathology, we just need it for making diagnosis and maybe tumor boards. The other barrier that I also think that the vendor ecosystem immaturity, when we start, looking for the scanner vendors, unlike radiology, DICOM compliance has been really the norm for decades. Many digital pathology vendors still, till today, yes, they provide as an option, but I haven't seen any single scanner vendor, they provide DICOM only, output or DICOM native output. This is what I'm really looking for. And also the way that, you need a DICOM viewer from that vendor. Unfortunately, majority of these vendors provide DICOM, but they don't provide a viewer. So the client struggle of literally validate those DICOM images. And just like Dr. Dash would say, the lack of awareness in pathology community. Many pathologists right now and pathology informaticists simply don't know a lot of DICOM that applies for their domain. It has, historically been, as we said, for radiology, but the awareness means that there is really no clinical demand from adoption for that institution. Without that demand, vendor might have little pressure to prioritize it and adopt it. No consistent procurement requirement. Hospitals and health system are not asking, about DICOM conformance statements when purchasing or when you are requesting for the RFP. And that's the problem. Conformance statement without validation, it's just a standard on paper. What you really need to ask is to ask for the conformance statement from that vendor and to do the comparison, and also ask that vendor whether they participate in previous Connectathon and whether they have a full conformance statement and validated. These are the barriers that I saw from when we went through our journey with Michigan Medicine.
No, thank you, Mustafa. And my journey's been similar. And so for us, exactly doing, and so here, DICOM, and one of the things that, we're not going into the technical details, but there's also DICOM, which is a DMZ pathway, which is a conventional on-prem pathway versus DICOM web, and kind of things like that. And in here, I think here, to your point, exactly, I think here from the vendor side, one of the things is exactly, and this is where I know several other people were in here. We're in a meeting that we were in the other day, talking with certain vendors relationship to utilizing standards and on their roadmap, because a lot of the individual companies have, pathologist panelists with those companies giving insight and things as to what are those next steps. And one, I think the big barrier is to say it's more about individual customization than it is about adopting the standard. And I think that's where the companies struggle. And so I think to that point, Mustafa, exactly, and what Raj said is exactly, it's a combination where it's on us as the pathologists, it's on us as the associations, which is why we're having this meeting here today, and to tie in all of these initiatives in that process to get us going. And so Kevin, so looking at it now about how organizations, so getting the powers in the collective kind of in that process. So how do you think organizations from healthcare organizations and associations out there can better collaborate across these, and specifically across specialties?
Let's see, specifically across specialties, that's a little bit more of a challenge. I think what we've already started to do some of that, right? So we've started to look at what lessons can we learn from radiology. We've had groups from our IHE Palm group go to the different IHE radiology groups, and we've kind of taken lessons from them in terms of what profiles are you working on, where can we leverage work that's already happened. So that's kind of what we've done from the technical standards development standpoint. But in terms of the organizations like DPA, SIM, and CAP collaborating, I think this DICOM toolkit is really a great first step, because what we've already talked about is how do we encourage our vendors, and we've already had a question or a comment in the chat about is there going to be something in there for doing vendor selection, and so how do we actually equip our different institutions with the knowledge they need to, like, how do we enable them to have this conversation when they're negotiating these systems and validating things with vendors, and what is it that they should be looking to hear? So I think we have a lot of pieces in play here, and so I think continuing to develop that toolkit, ensuring it works for everybody, and I would say we should go so far as letting the vendors know that this toolkit's coming out. They should know what questions they're going to have to address on the spot. They should have an answer prepared. This should enable a pretty smooth adoption pathway if everybody starts to get on the same page here. And so we can say as CAP, DP, and SIM that we support this work, and we think all the parties involved should have a look at it.
No, I agree. And I think that's perfect. And I think several of us have alluded to it already, is to say from like a customer perspective, seeing who's participated and been successful in these connect-a-thons. I think that is going to be part of this, exactly in that process, to say that where's that real world data in that process. All right. And then lastly, because I want to have some time here for questions from the audience in that process, quickly for everyone, what do you think success looks like over the next 1 to 3 years? We'll start with Raj.
So I am very hopeful that we'll get more vendors participating in the connect-a-thons and being hosted by IHE and DICOM. I think that would be the greatest measure of success, is just the greater number of vendors that are all working together, recognizing the importance of standardized workflows and a DICOM usage that supports the needs of the healthcare ecosystem.
Oh, thank you. How about Mustafa?
Yeah, I mean, I already mentioned that we really need, all the vendors to use a native DICOM only and with no proprietary. Vendor demonstrate DICOM conformance as a baseline procurement requirement. That's a must. We need also to make sure that all these DICOM tags or the metadata fields critical for AI and patient care, for example, specimen type, stain, scanner, and and also use standards like SNOMED, COCT, and most importantly, really, we need to have a measurable increase in the DICOM Working Group Connectathon, the IHE Connectathon, and participation from majority of pathology vendors.
No, thank you. Exactly that. And I know the nature of today was more to go about the DICOM toolkit, but the global connectathon that we're talking about, stay tuned. This is going to be coming out very soon. We expect everyone to. And so then, Kevin, what do you think success looks like over the next 1 to 3 years?
So I think there's a few different things that could show success. So if we have some vendors adding DPIA as a part of their marketing materials for their systems, I would consider that a huge success because it really shows that they're starting to buy into it, and that's how they want to push adoption. And I would love to see more vendors doing that, showing how they support the standards in different ways. So even if it's making their compliance statements readily available, I think that's a major thing. I would say over the next 2 years, I would say it's IHE completing the development of the rest of the profiles that we have in the pipeline for digital pathology adoption. And by year 3, showing that each one of these profiles has been tested by multiple vendors. They are proved as working just fine, so that once we start to look even a little further down the road, everyone's listing their compliance statements for support for all of the different profiles for native DICOM, and that's I think that's our roadmap for the next few years for success.
Oh, I think that sounds great. And then Alex, looking from an outside perspective from radiology, what do you think it looks like for us?
I agree with the things said already, and so I'll add something that's a little bit adjacent. Having more in the toolkit than just understanding DICOM, but how to connect the pieces together. And so there's a comment in the chat about what do you ask when you're selecting a vendor, and so having some common questions to ask on an RFP process that are sort of from an organizations can learn from each other and share it. And these are things around DICOM and IHE. We can understand the answers, and the vendors understand that that's something that we're interested in. It's the real world connectivity. How do I set up a DICOM modality work list so that we have the right data coming from the scanners in an automated way, and know how to do that so the correct metadata application happens automatically. Having tools like that are available to everyone in the community would be a really valuable addition.
I agree. No, I agree with all your statements. I agree. In the next 1 to 3 years, as we've already alluded to, the standards are robust as they currently stand. One thing that we hinted at is the idea is that the standards evolve with time, but it requires input from the space to be able to do that. So I agree. I think if within the 1 to 3 year time frame, we get the vendors out there having this be natively, they demonstrate the processes in these connectathons, they demonstrate it to the individuals, and we provide this DICOM toolkit, and we have some baseline on what the percentages of people out there are using DICOM, and that we show a meaningful increase in that process, and then the application with the IHE profiles. And so with that, just two quick last slides. I know I want to get into some time for questions here too, is one of the things that we heard about, and I think this is one of the things I just wanted to describe is, what is enterprise imaging? What is this process? Several of the individuals on this panel and discussion sit on an enterprise imaging subcommittee, which is sponsored by SIIM. And that process is about how do you fit all the pieces together? And I know which a little bit unique, and this happens in radiology too, where there's standalone radiology groups and standalone pathology groups. But you have to think about not only how they work for you, but how they interface with the customers and clients that what you have. And it's a larger puzzle that we have to fit together in. And this is one thing that as we're talking about, this is an illustration I put together a while ago. Traditionally with digital pathology, I think there's a misnomer that digital pathology is just about the H&E slide. And so here, thinking about the patient and the complexity that what's coming on in the groups, and you'll see within the CAP committees, also there is in vivo, ex vivo microscopy in this process. How does all of this imaging fit together? And so for me, implementing surgical pathology with cytopathology, hemopathology, microbiology are all being implemented at my institution. They're all different scanner vendors. They're all different processes. It's getting beyond that one-stop shop in that process, how they integrate. and how they integrate into that system. And so with that, I know here, we still have a couple minutes here for questions. I'd like to pause and go over a couple questions. Jennifer?
Sure. Thank you for the very enlightening discussion. I intentionally stayed quiet because I do represent the vendors. And I can say that this conversation is important. It's equally important to us as the vendors who are trying to help you through this process as well. So thank you for the information. And of course, we're here to help as well. So looking at the questions, thank you to the speakers who helped in answering them already. I thought maybe we can start with what hasn't been answered yet and then cover some of those that have been. We have a question here. We talked about the many reasons why adoption is important and all the value it would bring, but it hasn't happened. I think understanding why, especially the economic factors, is important. If the value hasn't been unlocked yet, there is a barrier, and understanding the barrier can be lowered seems key. I post this as not as a technical issue, but I guess from reading the tone of the question, this is more of a change management education like some of the speakers have already shared. Any thoughts or comments to that beyond what we've already covered on the barriers?
I wanted to surface one of the comments that David Clooney had put into the chat as a big part of the answer to this question. The first purchase of an imaging management system or a slide scanner, you may not care about it. And so it's not as important in that first purchase, but it's the second purchase. If you want to choose either a new vendor or just an updated version to make sure that your data will work on your imaging viewing system is really important. And that's why I showed that in the radiology slides. It took radiology departments getting multiple scanners from multiple vendors to say, oh, this is a major problem we need to fix. Right. And the way to fix it is with standards. And so I think part of the answer is digital pathology is still in the early days, even though there's been a standard for a long time. And as departments grow into this area and practices grow, this problem will become more and more apparent.
Agreed. And I think that was what I wanted to highlight that last slide, is that as pathology, we start with a scanner for H&E. And now you're going to add in something for microbiology, add in something for cytology. How do you integrate those processes? And one thing also to kind of piggyback on David's comment, one of the things that what we can share is looking at the post that the DPA has shared with the work with the FDA. And one of the goals from there is exactly that, is to try to think about how to break up that pixel pipeline and have each individual have a standalone component assessment. And the only way this is possible is through standards.
And can I add just a few comments that also regarding interoperability? If you archived all these images in your proprietary format, you're gonna really struggle, when you move from for the next next vendor or next contract with whether PACS or VNA, whatever. And it's a nightmare. It's a huge headache to convert all this if you're gonna, adopt standardization and DICOM. So the most important thing from the beginning, you have to write it in your contract to work with your vendor. If they don't provide a DICOM standard today, ask them what is the timeline. Put it in your contract, make sure that they will cover anything, after that time in case of conversion or providing native DICOM.
Thank you for that. And maybe we take one more question. I know we're almost at time. There is the question around secondary capture and the implications that it has to natural language. Dr. Dash, you started to comment in the chat. Maybe a quick voiceover there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to leverage a standard when you have digital assets that are currently being stored in an ad hoc fashion. And secondary capture, leveraging DICOM is certainly one way to do that. There was specifically mention to natural language processing. There are other standards out there also when thinking about natural language processing, such as the electronic cancer protocols and structured data capture format in IHE that can help mitigate the variability associated with natural language processing. So I would say that it's not only about DICOM in that circumstance for natural language processing, but definitely we should advocate for the use of the standards working together to solve specific problems. And so once we define what problem to solve in IHE, put a profile around it, and then we can leverage all of the standards, DICOM, SDC, and others to address that kind of issue.
Thank you very much. For the rest of the questions that were answered in the Q&A, we will share them as part of the recorded session. Again, thank you for participating in today's webinar, and to our presenters for the great conversation and content. I talk about this almost every day as part of my professional career, and I myself feel like I've learned a little bit today as well. So thank you for that. John, if you can bring up the slides again, because we would love to close with input from our participants as far as survey. It helps us further improve our content. We want to make sure that we are covering the information that is relevant for your day-to-day operations and planning of the future. So we do have a quick barcode for you to provide your feedback. And we also have some upcoming talks. The next one is Introduction to DICOM, a digital pathology course. That'll be in early May. If you haven't already registered, please do. And the SIIM-DPA Bridge Pass, that's also upcoming in October as part of the PathVisions conference. So thanks again for joining today's webinar. Please complete the survey and see you at the next one. John, any other closing remarks?
No, thank you, everyone. And I like all the comments here. If you feel like you need any more of the questions answered, please feel free to reach out to any of us at any time here and there. I like seeing that there's some vendors I know that I've been talking to in there in the space that are committed. I like that. And so I think this is a great start. So thank you, everyone.
We're listening. We can reassure you we're listening. So thank you. Have a great one.